The rule of the lawless. No concerted attempt was made by the roughs to avenge the execution of their comrades. Whether they realized that such an attempt would be likely to solidify the decent element, or whether that sort of warfare was not their habit, the afternoon and night wore away without trouble. "Danger's over," announced Johnny the following morning. "What next?" I asked. "We'll go up to town," said Johnny. This they proceeded to do, negativing absolutely my desire to accompany them. "You stay out of this," said Johnny. "Go and wash gold as usual." I was immensely relieved that afternoon when they returned safe and sound. Afterward I heard that they had coolly visited every saloon and gambling place, had stopped in each to chat with the barkeepers and gamblers, had spent the morning seated outside the Bella Union, and had been in no manner molested. "They'll be all right as long as they stick together and keep in the open," Yank assured me. "That gang will sooner assassinate than fight." Although for the moment held in check by the resolute front presented by these three boys, the rough element showed that it considered it had won a great victory and was now entitled to run to town. Members of the gang selected what goods they needed at any of the stores, making no pretense of payment. They swaggered boldly about the streets at all times, infested the better places such as the Bella Union, elbowed aside insolently any inoffensive citizen who might be in their way, and generally conducted themselves as though they owned the place. Robberies grew more frequent. The freighters were held up in broad daylight. Rumors of returning miners being relieved of their dust drifted up from the lower country. Mysterious disappearances increased in number. Hardly an attempt was made to conceal the fact that the organized gang that conducted these operations had its headquarters at Italian Bar. Strange men rode up in broad daylight, covered with red dust, to confer with Morton or one of the other resident blackguards. Mysteriously, every desperado in the place began to lay $50 octagonal slugs on the gambling tables, product of some lower country atrocity. The camp soon had a concrete illustration of the opinion the roughs held of themselves. It was reported quietly among a few of us that several of our number had been marked by the desperados. Two of these were Joe Thompson, who had acted as counsel for the prosecution in the late trial, and Tom Cleveland, who had presided and presided well over the court. Thompson kept one of the stores, while Cleveland was proprietor of the butcher shop. No overt threats were made, but we understood that somehow these men were to be put out of the way. Of course they were at once warned. The human mind is certainly a queer piece of mechanism. It would seem that the most natural thing to have done in the circumstances would have been to dog these men's footsteps until an opportunity offered to assassinate them quietly. That's just what would have been done had the intended victims been less prominently in the public eye. The murder of court officials, however, was a very different matter from the finding of an unknown miner dead in his camp or along the trail. In the former case, there could be no matter of doubt as to the perpetrators of the deed. The animus was too directly to be traced, and it is a matter for curious remark that in all early history, whether of California in the 40s or of Montana in the bloodier 60s, the desperados, no matter how strong they felt themselves or how arrogantly they ran the community, nevertheless, must have felt a great uncertainty as to the actual power of the decent element. This is evidenced by the fact that they never worked openly. Though the identity of each of them as a robber and cutthroat was a matter of common knowledge, so that any miner could have made out a list of the members of any band, the fact was never formally admitted. And as long as it was not admitted, and as long as actual hard proof was lacking, it seemed to be part of the game that nothing could be done. Moral certainties did not count until some series of outrages resulted in mob action. Now consider this situation, which seemed to me then, as it seems to me now, most absurd in every way. Nobody else considered it so. Everybody knew that the rough element was out to get Thompson and Cleveland. Everybody, including both Thompson and Cleveland themselves, were pretty certain that they would not be quietly assassinated. The argument in that case being that the deed would be apt to raise the community. Therefore, it was pretty well understood that some sort of quarrel or personal encounter would be used as an excuse. Personally, I could not see that would make much essential difference, but as I said, the human mind is a curious piece of a mechanism. Among the occasional visitors to the camp was a man who called himself Harry Crawford. He was a man of perhaps 25 years, tall, rather slender, with a clear face and laughing blue eyes. Nothing in his appearance indicated the desperado, and yet we had long known him as one of the Morgan gang. This man now took up his residence in camp, and we soon discovered that he was evidently the killer. The first afternoon, he picked some sort of petty quarrel with Thompson over a purchase, but cooled down instantly when unexpectedly confronted by half a dozen miners who came in at the opportune moment. A few days afterwards, in the slack time of the afternoon, Thompson, while drinking at the bar of the Empire and conversing with a friend, was approached by a well-known, sodden hanger-on of the saloons. "What in hell you fellas talking about?" demanded this man impudently. "None of your business," replied Thompson impatiently, for the man was a public nuisance and besides was deep in Thompson's debt. The man broke into foul oaths. "I dare you to fight," he cried in a furious passion. Facing about, Thompson saw Crawford standing attentively among the listeners and instantly comprehended the situation. "You have the odds of me with a pistol," said Thompson, who notoriously had no skill with that weapon. "Why should I fight you?" "Well then," cried the man, "put up your fists. That'll show who is the best man." He snatched off his belt and laid it on the bar. Thompson did the same. "Come on," cried the challenger, backing away. Thompson, thoroughly angry, reached over and slapped his antagonist. The latter promptly drew another revolver from beneath his coat, but before he could aim it, Thompson jumped at his throat and disarmed him. At this moment Crawford interfered, apparently as peacemaker. Thompson was later told secretly by the barkeeper that the scheme was to lure him into a pistol fight in the street, when Crawford would be ready to shoot him as soon as the first shot was fired. On the strength of his interference, Crawford next pretended to friendship and spent much of his time at Thompson's store. Thompson was in no way deceived. This state of affairs continued for 2 days. It terminated in the following manner. Crawford, sitting half on the counter and talking with all the great charm of which he was master, led the subject to weapons. "This revolver of mine," said he, at the same time drawing the weapon from its holster, "is one of the old Navy model. You don't often see them nowadays. It has a double lock." He cocked it as though to illustrate his point, and the muzzle, as though by accident, swept toward the other man. He looked up from his affected close examination to find that Thompson had also drawn his weapon and that the barrel was pointing uncompromisingly in his direction. For a moment the two stared each other in the eye. Then Crawford sheathed his pistol with an oath. "What do you mean by that?" he cried. "I mean," said Thompson firmly, "that I do not intend you shall get the advantage of me. You know my opinion of you and your gang. I shall not be shot by any of you if I can help it." Crawford withdrew quietly, but later in the day approached a big group of us, one of which was Thompson. "There's a matter between you and me has got to be settled," he cried. "Well, I can't imagine what it is," replied Thompson. "I'm not aware that I've said or done anything to you that needs settlement." "You needn't laugh," replied Crawford, with a string of insulting oaths. "You're a coward, and if you're anything of a man, You will step outdoors and have this out." "I am, as you say, a coward," replied Thompson quietly, "and I see no reason for going out of doors to fight you or anybody else." After blustering and swearing for a few moments, Crawford withdrew. He made no attempt to fight, nor do I believe his outburst had any other purpose than to establish the purely personal character of the quarrel between Thompson and himself. At any rate, Thompson was next morning found murdered in his bunk, while Crawford had disappeared. I do not know whether Crawford killed him or not. I think not. About this time, formal printed notices of some sort of election were posted on the bulletin board at Morton's place. At least they were said to have been posted, and were pointed out to all comers the day after election. Perhaps they were there all the time, as claimed, but nobody paid much attention to them. At any rate, we one day awoke to the fact that we were a full-fledged community, with regularly constituted court officers, duly qualified officials, and a sheriff. The sheriff was Morton, and the most worthy judges were other members of his gang. This move tickled Danny Randall's sense of humor immensely. "That's good head work," he said approvingly. "I didn't think Morton had it in him." "It's time something was done to run that gang out of town," fumed Dr. Rankin. "No, it is not time," denied Danny, "any more than it was time when you and Johnny and the rest of you had your celebrated jury trial." "I'd like to know what you're driving at," fretted the worthy doctor. Danny Randall laughed in his gentle little fashion. I will confess that just at that time, I was very decidedly wondering what Danny Randall was at. In fact, at moments, I was strongly inclined to doubt his affiliations. He seemed to stand in an absolutely neutral position, inclining to neither side. Tom Cleveland was killed in the open street by one of the Empire hanger-ons. The man was promptly arrested by Morton in his capacity of sheriff and confined in chains. Morton, as sheriff, selected those who were to serve on the jury. I had the curiosity to attend the trial, expecting to assist at an uproarious farce. All the proceedings, on the contrary, were conducted with the greatest decorum, and with minute attention to legal formalities. The assassin, however, was acquitted. From that time, the outrages increased in number and in boldness. No man known to possess any quantity of gold was safe. It was dangerous to walk alone after dark, to hunt alone in the mountains, to live alone. Every man carried his treasure about with him everywhere he went. No man dared raise his voice in criticism of the ruling powers, for it was pretty generally understood that such criticism meant death. It would be supposed naturally by you in our modern and civilized days that such a condition of affairs would cast a fear and gloom over the life of the community. Not at all. Men worked and played and gambled and drank and joked and carried on the light-hearted, jolly existence of the camps just about the same as ever. Outside a few principals like Morton and his immediate satellites, there was no accurate demarcation between the desperados and the miners. Indeed, no one was ever quite sure where his next neighbor's sympathies lay. We all mingled together, joked, had a good time, and were exceedingly cautious. It was a polite community. Personal quarrels were the product of the moment, and generally settled at the moment or soon after. Enmities were matters for individual adjustment. Randall's express messengers continued to make their irregular trips with the gold dust. They were never attacked, though they were convinced, and I think justly, that on numerous occasions they had only just escaped attack. Certainly the sums of money they carried were more than sufficient temptation to the bandits. They knew their country, however, and were full of Indian-like ruses, twists, doublings, and turns which they employed with great gusto. How long they would have succeeded in eluding what I considered the inevitable, I do not know. But at this time occurred the events that I shall detail in the next chapter.